All right. For some reason, I didn't set up my microphone. I would like to use this one. um. So yeah, this. I think. I think for me, it slowly gets more awkward to do uh, YouTube videos. I feel like I'm not really sure. Yeah, I do think it's becoming slightly more difficult for me to do YouTube videos, mainly because I feel more. I feel like I'm growing more into writing than you could say talking it out. Um, but uh, yeah, so let's go into some of the things that has been on my mind, and I've been really thinking about philosophy and what it does and its function. I feel that in a relative agreement, philosophy has a kind of useless functionality to it. But when I say useless, I mean useless in the sense that it cannot function in a way to give us solutions about things. But philosophy is useful in the sense that it problematizes our situation, or it wants to problematize what we think or believe to be the problem. But in my experience of thinking and doing philosophy for a while, is that I become, in some sense, more and more impotent to give answers and to give real, you could say, solutions to things. And I could say this: the more that I think, the more that you could say, progress in my thinking, the more that I reach these moments where I cannot. I get these moments of stuttering, like the way you hear me now. It's crazy that my speech becomes it reaches a kind of impasse where I can't really get at what I want to say or do, because my mind is immediately beginning to understand that there's a limit here. I can't go beyond this limit in some sense. But limits are useful in helping us think, that actually it helps us go back to the original problem. Limits help us re-problematize what we thought was the problem. And philosophy, there's something about philosophy that cannot be taught. And I'm going to try to express this as clear as I can. What is it about philosophy that cannot be taught? The one thing that philosophy cannot teach you is that it cannot teach you, ironically, how to think. This, in my opinion, is perhaps the most ironic position of philosophy. Um, there is I believe, a passage where Badu talks about this, that philosophy is a kind of encounter with something. This is philosophy can't teach you this. Like, if we're talking about categorical institutionalized philosophy. Philosophy cannot teach you this. And what does it really mean to think? I don't believe that it can actually teach you. And this is why I felt Socrates spent so much time trying to discern between actual thinking and sophistry, right? This kind of rhetoric. I mean, I think it's even more impossible today to determine between uh, actual thinking and sophistry. And because what Socrates and Plato through Socrates tries to tell us is that you can't teach virtue. You can't teach it. The wisdom that you know, the knowledge that you have, this is all, in some sense, socialized learning. You can't actually teach virtue. And this is what Socrates will argue. Um, but to me, there's an element of philosophy that you cannot be taught, that cannot be taught. It simply just cannot be taught. Um, you could say it's through the living of doing philosophizing that you learn, or you begin to know what it is, but it's not something that can just simply be taught to you. I cannot teach you how to think. I can only ever question what you think. And though you can copy its method, you can mimic its method, you still don't understand the wisdom behind that method. Why are you doing what you're doing? I cannot teach you that. And philosophy cannot teach you the reason why you do the method that you do. It's not simply because the method is superior in any sense or in any regard, is that there's something about the method that the wisdom cannot reach. I mean, that you cannot reach the wisdom about such method. And so my return to Plato has, really presented this kind of frustration. Why is Socrates so? Uh, why does Socrates question and problematize everything? Well, I mean, it's fundamentally because he knows that human wisdom is kind of worthless and is so little, that the only true wisdom is to point out that we have very little wisdom. But to do that as a method, as a way of being, again, you can mimic this, but you won't understand what you're actually doing. And that's something that, again, I don't think anybody can teach you. Like I said before, we can teach you the methods, and philosophy can teach you all sorts of methods of thinking and approaching problems and questioning problems, but that doesn't teach you the core of philosophy for me. Because let me frame it this way. When you problematize a problem, and this is something that you see in the dialogue of Euthyphro, actually, are you is the problem something that you desire to be a problem? Or is it a problem because it's actually a problem? This is something similar to the way Socrates presents the whole, talking to Euthyphro about what is exactly pious and impious, right? And Euthyphro responds and says, well, pious is what is loved by the gods, right? And then Socrates is like, well, what is loved by the gods in some sense, right? And then Euthyphro goes, well, what is pious? That's what's loved by the gods. But what Socrates is trying to point out is that it's very difficult to say that something has changed without you already changing it to say that it's changed. So Socrates, in some ways, is saying that the subject is already involved in its saying that something has changed or something has been affected, right? It's not something is affected, it's the fact that something was already affected to make it affected. And it's very confusing in Euthyphro when you do that. But basically, the main point is that the subject is involved. It's not like an objective thing that something has changed and something is affected. It's like, no, the subject is also what affects it and what changes it. And this is what Socrates is trying to um, kind of filter out. And this is what we mean. And this is what's difficult about philosophy to teach you, is that when we start presenting problems, how do you know that it's not a problem that you desire to be a problem versus an actual problem? And this is very difficult, right? Because in some sense, in my experience, the biggest difficulty I've ever had philosophizing is myself, is my own self egotistical impediment to philosophize, right? Because the tendency of philosophers is that we have a tendency to forget. We start thinking that when we start constructing ideas, that these are my ideas, and then we start defending our ideas. And as much as there's honor in defending your ideas, we have to really put it in the context of this. When you say you're defending an idea, are you defending the idea for the sake of the idea, or because are you defending the idea because you love the idea? And this almost feels like the same predicament that Socrates presents in Euthyphro, in the dialogue of Euthyphro. And what, in my opinion, Socrates shows is that the ego is involved. Desire is involved when we're doing philosophy. And this is why I feel like Socrates' idea of the good is a helpful kind of vision towards something, because if you can't discern within yourself whether you love the idea because it's your idea, or because you love the idea because it's the idea itself that is worth being loved, that those are two different uh, situations. But in our actual lives, that is not that does not present itself as obvious. That is not as obvious to us to present this situation. So when we approach this, and when we think about these problems, um, in my own experience, I have really stunted myself, in the sense of I kept wanting to cherish ideas because they were my ideas. But really, the proper defense of an idea is not because you should love the idea because it's your idea, but you love the idea because it's the idea itself that is worth loving. And what does it mean that when an idea is worth loving? It means that you're even it's even worth possibly dropping that idea. It's even worth it to say that you love an idea, is to also allow its rejection, allow its annihilation, and now allow its rethinking, its retransfiguration, its renewal. Um, and this is something that I feel like a lot of people, a lot of a lot of beginning philosophers struggle with. Just like me, when I started, I couldn't really discern this, and it's probably even taken me till now to uh, to be willing sacrifice the idea, because to love an idea is also to allow it to die, and to let go. um, and that is also, in my opinion, that is also a way of defending the idea. And this is and it's funny because to me, now that I've returning, I'm doing a sort of return to Plato. It's become really significant that that Socrates, even though he has his ideas, he's willing to defend his ideas in to the extent that he's willing to accept his annihilation of it, right? Um, and so we must think that to defend an idea is not to maintain its livelihood, but to also allow its rejection and its annihilation, um, which we must think differently when it comes to thinking about what does it mean to defend an idea. What does it mean to defend your work in a real way? Uh, Most of us get caught up when we feel attacked by someone else's critique about our work. But fundamentally, and this is something that Gadamer points out in his interpretation of Plato, is that a true dialogue is not destroying your enemy's position, but but helping his enemy stand up again, right? And if you think about this, it's almost similar to perhaps the way boxing kind of functions, right? If a boxer kind of falls, the his opponent has to stop basically beating him up, right? He has to wait for him to get up, and then we fight, and and we duke it out. But you could think of dialogue as a kind of boxing match, whereas arguments seem to be more of like, I'm going to even kick you if you're down. I'm going to even kill you if you're not even looking at me. And that's not how Socrates wants to do dialogue. At least this is the interpretation through Gadamer, that dialogue is more about bringing your opponent back up to his feet. Um, it may even be strengthening his position, right? And if you think about it, even allowing your enemy to get back up is a kind of, strengthening of his position. Of course, there's referees in boxing matches. There aren't referees technically in dialogues. Um, so we have to, in my opinion, be our kind of worst enemy in the sense of being our own referee. Um, but you see, philosophy doesn't teach you this. Um, it can teach you this distinction, but it can't actually teach you what does it mean to actually do this, and how does this actually translate to your um, real life. You have to, in some sense, uh, live through it. There is no other way. Um, and this is also a lot of the damage that philosophy has done to itself, right? That in philosophy, we read a lot of philosophers, and we attack a lot of philosophers, kind of blindly, kind of just so easily, that I think Cadell Last gave a really good point on this. He goes, it's so easy to attack dead men. And what's funny about this is that dead men, the dead men that we appreciate and also despise, whichever philosopher that is for you, um, is merely, in some sense, projections of ourselves. What do I mean by that? It means that whenever somebody gives an interpretation of Plato, it's not Plato speaking. it's a twofold. You are trying to speak for Plato, right? It's similar to when a friend tries to speak for you. It may not exactly correspond to actually how you feel and how you perceive the world, but it's your friend trying to and give attempt to speak for you when you cannot speak for yourself. Um, and we have to look at it this way, that when we talk about philosophers like Plato and Socrates, we are speaking for them. And yet sometimes the philosophical conversations seem to really obscure this fundamental fact that actually it's not necessarily that Plato is Plato. It's the fact that actually when we're talking about Plato, we're talking about Javier's Plato. We're talking about Daniel Garner, Daniel Garner's Hume, right? We're talking about Cadell's last Hegel. We're talking about their own reading of what this person is saying. And so in some sense, though it's easy to dismiss Kant and Plato, um, what we prevent ourselves from doing is grappling with the particularity of the one that is speaking for Plato or for Kant or for Lacan or for Hegel and so on. So it's not just some objective reality of like, oh, Kant is like this, Hegel is like that. It's not clear. It's not fucking clear at all. Um, and we all disagree about how one should read Plato and how one should read Hegel and how one should read Kant, and so on, because we're all speaking for dead men. So this is the risk that happens in dialogue. We either risk becoming zombies, right? Sort of just thinking that we're only speaking for the dead, um, or we actually realize that we're just trying to respect the dead. Um, and the only way to understand that we respect the dead is to understand that when somebody like me talks about Plato, the way to respect the dead is not that, of course, my understanding of respect the dead would be I'm trying to give the best voice to Plato, right? That presents his position. But also a way to respect the dead is to look at when I speak of Plato, is for you to understand that it's my understanding of Plato. You get what I mean? Like this is the difficulty in kind of dividing this up, is that it's my understanding of Plato. But if you understand it's my understanding of Plato, you shouldn't just be attacking Plato. You should be like, the only thing that you should be attacking is perhaps my understanding of Plato, not attacking Plato. This is what is always difficult, but typically most philosophical conversations go around attacking the dead philosopher rather than dealing with the person that is presenting or trying to speak for the philosopher. And this is what becomes difficult. You know, and something that I've realized in book clubs is that it bewilders me how it just bewilders me the variety of interpretations that people get from reading the same passage. Like it bewilders me what actually occurs in this. And if you have a book group, you can really grapple with the different interpretations of a philosopher. But when you are in a sort of more broad setting, like maybe a philosophical communion or a philosophical meeting, um, we're not reading these texts together, and we're not discussing our reading of these texts together. we're all speaking about different philosophers and different readings, and so this makes it more difficult to perhaps even challenge or think through, and so a lot of the misunderstanding is always sort of dismissing the philosopher rather than just simply challenging what is presented. um, and uh, this is the huge discrepancy, is that we can both read Plato, and I can say Plato, for example, here's a reading of Plato that I've been willing to entertain as a sort of Platonic Lacanian thing. I want to say das Ding. I want to put Plato in relation to das Ding, where the good is the das Ding. Um, and this borrows from Murdoch's idea of the good, where it's undefinable. You can't really, it's sort of like not in this world, so to speak. But I would, to make it Lacanian, it would be the good in the other, the unknown good in the other, which is not present, not in this world. There's a way to work it, you know what I mean? But I've been lately thinking about that, right? But you see, if somebody was also reading Plato, they may disagree. They say, no, I don't find any relation to dusting. In fact, that's just a horrible connection, right? That's this horrible connection. And or perhaps a Lacanian would be like, no, 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 das Ding is this, and you can't say it is that, right? Again, what we're encountering is my interpretation of Lacan, my interpretation of Plato, their interpretation of Plato, their interpretation of Lacan. Where do we go from here, right? What is happening? And this is what I mean by this, that you can't just attack a person for, you can't attack the individual for the reading of. To me, this is always the wrong method. In fact, what you have to do is you have to play with the material that is what the individual presents with. And this is the importance, in my opinion, of what Plato shows you through Socrates. Socrates doesn't go, oh, that's the incorrect reading of Lacan, right? Or that's the incorrect reading of Plato. Socrates doesn't do that. Socrates starts with what you have at hand. And he says, okay, so you say this, right? And then the person says yes or no. And then he goes, okay, so if you say this, then would you say this too? Like Socrates tries to build up the argument, right? Tries to help you take your argument further, make a further distinction, help you clarify. And through clarification, you start understanding that perhaps you don't understand your concepts at all, right? And so this, in my opinion, is a better way to grapple with philosophical deprivation or disagreements, because what we have a tendency to do is completely subtract the individual that is talking about Socrates or Lacan, and we just simply look at our reading or understanding of Lacan and we say, no, that's wrong. Right? That's just wrong. But see, that doesn't get us anywhere. That never gets us anywhere, really. In my experience, it doesn't get us anywhere. The purpose, the real thing to do, in my opinion, is to start where they are. And again, this is what I've been learning by going back to Socrates, is to start where they are, right? What do you think? What is your definition of das Ding? Okay, this is your definition of das Ding. Okay, what is your understanding of the good? Okay, right? And if an individual decides to connect his definition to das Ding, to the good, then you have to work with that. That is the material that you work with. That is how you have dialogue. But a hardcore Platonist or a hardcore Lacanian would completely reject any of this playing. They don't want to play. And so, in some sense, they don't want to dialogue either. They don't want to have dialogue. They want to have argument, basically. And this is, again, this is what philosophy can't teach you. And this is what something that has taken me a stupid long time to understand. A stupid long time to understand that actually the whole point of conversation is to simply play with what is present. Whatever somebody brings to the table, you don't get sidetracked by the names of which they give, like Lacan, Zizek, so on. The whole point of conversation and dialogue, in my opinion, and thinking and real thinking is to give and play with what everybody presents in that conversation, in that dialogue. You could say I would say Socrates was a phenomenological master in terms of dialogue, because he played with what people gave him as definitions, uh, as what they presented. I think he was really probably, I, I mean, I don't know about this claim, but I guess I'll throw it anyways because it's a spicy claim. Perhaps Socrates was the first, phenomenologist, in terms of dialogue, because I find it impossible that Socrates never refers to anything outside other than what is already within the dialogue. He'll say he may refer to something outside the dialogue, but he'll always ask them, "Do you agree with this?" And they'll say yes or no, right? And then depending on how they say yes or no, he'll say, "Okay, so if you agree, then wouldn't you also agree that this and this would be a problem?" And sometimes they'll say, "No, I don't think that's a problem." And then Socrates, "Well, why not? It seems to me it's a problem, right?" Um, and so Socrates really works with what is being presented, and I feel like most philosophical conversation doesn't work with what is being presented. In fact, they try to bring things from outside to obscure and prevent the other from having a dialogue. Um, so it's not about Kant or Lacan. It's about the way the individual presents Lacan and all these other philosophers that you must play with, that you must have a dialogue with. To me, it's not fruitful enough to um, simply disagree with the fact that they just bring up Lacan, and you could say this really happens a lot with philosophers like Plato and Kant, because everybody knows that Kant is the worst, and so on. But really, it's not that. It's more about grappling, like, okay, so what's your understanding of Kant in this case? How are you understanding Kant? I don't. That's the one thing that we don't know. And it's the same thing when I bring up Plato, is that people have to ask, okay, so what's your understanding of Plato in this sense, and how are you connecting Plato to doesnt, right? Because obviously you have to do a kind of like misreading to do this connection, and I agree, you do. But the problem isn't the misreading. The problem is working with what the individual is presenting to you, and then trying to show in a kind of gratuitous manner, like a kind of manner of humility, of love for the idea, right? And a part of loving the other's idea is that you also have to show its flaws and its faults and its and the way that it is, right? That your partner's idea is not some delusion, not some fantasy. And so we have to work together to help uh, present the idea, which is difficult because ego and desire wants to defend, doesn't like that. Ego and desire does not like that, I would say. Does not like that at all. Um, and this is, to me, the constant uh, battle with philosophy, that ego and desire is constantly infiltrating philosophical understanding and thinking, um, that you could say when desire is involved without being purified, it is sophistry, really. Um, it's delusion. It's fantasy. It's ultimately fantasy. Um, and uh, you know, I will admit I've had many ideas that were fantasy, basically. Um, and so, yeah, this is the parts of philosophy that I don't think I can teach you, because when you're in a conversation with someone, it's very difficult to just navigate all of that bullshit. Uh, and so the only method is really, and this is why I'm returning to Plato again, is that uh, you have to, in some sense, be put on trial. I think a lot of dialogue, a lot of real dialogue, is similar to the way Athens puts Socrates on trial, and Socrates, the way he responds is to simply be what he is, and to simply be what you are is to also risk the possibility of death. And this is where philosophy is like dying, and this is where we must, in some sense, learn to die. But learning to die in a philosopher's world is uh, letting your idea go, letting the annihilation of your idea go. If you love your idea, it's not too much different from a person, in a sense, where um, you have to risk its annihilation. That it's possible that your idea doesn't, in some sense, love you back, right? And so in this case, love doesn't demand a return, but again, love allows an idea to be what it is. And if it's a bad idea, then it's a bad idea. You know, you have to let it be. Um, but what's funny about this is that you have to also defend it, right? And so to defend it, like the way Socrates does in the Apology, is to also risk its death. But it shows in reality how little we're willing to risk and defend our idea in the sense of risking its possibility to die. I think that is fundamentally the thing that cannot be taught. That I cannot teach you how to die. That is, I cannot. We just cannot teach you how to die. You can mimic its methods. You can mimic anything philosophy presents to you, but it cannot teach you how to die. Because fundamentally, like Derrida says, death is always your own. You know, it's always your own death. It's never, somebody else's death. You can die for somebody, but it's fundamentally always your death. And even if you die for somebody, they still have to die their own death. So you still, at the end of the day, um, have your own death. And these are the ideas that ideas have some similarities to death in this case too. But anyways, I think that's really it. Um, yeah. All right. Hope you guys enjoyed. Take care.